that we are doing this. I'm so delighted that we are doing this and um, want to welcome all of you here. We are delighted and overwhelmed by the number of people who signed up. This is obviously a topic of great interest. And I said to the panel members earlier, perhaps we can make this a series rather than a one-time event, since there is so much interest. Um, Deep bow of gratitude to my panel members who will be introducing themselves here shortly. So grateful for your willingness to be here and do this with us. And I want to acknowledge up front that there's a limit to what we can do in 90 minutes. This is, as I said, obviously a topic of interest, and each of our panel members is going to have about 10 to 11 minutes to do their introductory remarks, and then we will entertain questions from the audience to have the discussion after that. So I apologize in advance for that limitation. We hope to have the last 30 minutes be part of that question and answer. So if you have questions, if they come up while you're listening, please write them into the chat. We'll be taking questions from the chat function after the panel members have had a chance to make their remarks. Also, want to remind you that if you're hoping to get CEUs for this presentation, you will be getting them. You need to have your full name in your little box so that Melissa knows who to send the CEU to. So if you have just a first name, or if you have a phone number or something else, please put your full name in your box so that Melissa knows where the CEUs need to go. And if you're not sure how to do that, let us know in the chat. We appreciate it very much. So, without further ado, I have asked our panel to address a couple of things up front. To briefly introduce who they are and why they have an interest in this area, to talk some about what they see in their practice and or how they work with issues of religious trauma to promote healing. So that's very open and very vague. And again, they're going to have a very limited amount of time. So we will just touch on the topics and then go into discussion. Melissa, have I covered everything? All right. So I think we will just go in alphabetical order here, and we'll start with Emily Joy Allison. How about that? Alphabetical by last name.
The curse of having a last name that starts with A. I always have to go first for everything. Well, thank you guys for being here. I'm really honored to be here with y'all. I think I am possibly one of the few non-therapists and non-social workers in the room right now. I am an author. I am an advocate. In my day job, I work in politics for an organization that focuses on access to reproductive health care. And I have also researched and written a lot about the intersection of faith, gender, sexuality, and religious trauma, and how all those things connect to each other, both in very recent history. Even it's not lost on me that we're having this discussion the day after the SBC report just came out. For those of you who have seen that, hundreds and hundreds of abuse cases that have been systematically covered up in the Southern Baptist Church, and they limited their scope to only 21 years. So that's just within the last 21 years that they were looking at those cases. Who else is to say what happened before that? But yeah, that's kind of my area of expertise there. I have an undergraduate degree in Christian theology, and I'm a recent graduate of the Master of Theological Studies program at Vanderbilt Divinity School. I know there's some other Vandy people in the room, but I got the Carpenter Certificate there in religion, gender, and sexuality. And I just recently, in March of 2021, published my book, which is right here. This is my book that I wrote. It's called Church 2. And it is based on the hashtag that I co-founded in November of 2017 when I came forward about my own abuse story at the megachurch that I went to in high school. And so that was November of 2017 was obviously when Me Too was first, going viral the way that we know it now on social media. Of course, it had existed long before that. Tarana Burke had been working with the phrase Me Too and with the Me Too movement for a decade at that point, but that's when it went viral on social media. And I was reading all of the stories, just obsessively reading all of the stories that were coming forward about all of these men in Hollywood and in Washington. And it struck me that like I had also this story of this thing that was both sexually and religiously traumatizing to me. But it was difficult to see myself reflected in some of the conversations, because the way that I have always described this is like, you don't really see like Harvey Weinstein, for example, justifying his actions with a chapter and verse from the Bible. But you will see pastors doing that. You will see religious people doing that. And so there's this added layer to it that is, it's one thing for this horrible thing to happen to you, but it's another thing for then your community to come around and say, well, that's how God wanted it. That was God's will. According to the Bible, it makes sense that this happened to you because you were doing something wrong. And it's that spiritual and religious trauma on top of that. And I would say, in my case, personally, in my own experience, and also with a lot of other survivors that I have talked to and worked with over the years, a persistent and recurrent theme that comes up really frequently is that the way that my religious community, my religious parents, my church responded to what happened to me was worse than the thing that happened to me. And I've heard people say that. I've heard people say that out loud, like it was a more traumatizing thing, their reaction to it, than even the thing that happened itself. And I have found that to be true, not for everybody, obviously, but for a lot of folks. Like it's a statistically significant number of people that feel that way. And so I came forward with my story in November of 2017, and I just said, I think there's something here. I think there's something here that like we need to have a conversation about, because I know it's not, prior to that, a lot of, when you think about like sex abuse and religion, a lot of people erroneously attributed that to mostly just being like a thing in the Catholic Church, because that was what had sort of dominated the media narratives up until that point. And I was like, I know this is not true. Like, I know this is everywhere. I know this is on all these denominations. I've talked to these people. We all talk to each other. It's not a secret. And so, I kind of shared my story and popped this hashtag on there. And then overnight it just went viral, and it has been used across platforms, Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and TikTok and all these every day for the last 4 years, and continues to be used on a daily basis. And I think I'm in like a really like emotional place around it right now, because I just spent all day yesterday reading I didn't read every word. I skipped, I skimmed a little bit, but I made it to the end of that 288-page document, like hell or high water. I like finished it last night. And it was just so sobering to think about, because, the Southern Baptist Convention is one thing. And we could all probably, anybody who has any kind of theological education, like shout out Vandy, we could all sit around and analyze the theology that leads to these kind of things. But I think what struck me from reading the report that just came out yesterday was just how it's all the same everywhere. Like nothing in that report was unique to the SBC. Like that, the way that my abuse was handled was the exact same, even though the church wasn't SBC. You can talk to survivors of all kinds of religious and sexual trauma in all kinds of religious communities. And essentially the way these power structures are operating are the same. And it's very sobering, and it's very tragic. So I think that having an understanding of how religion functions as like an aggravating factor, how religious trauma functions as an aggravating factor for what is already going on in people's lives is really, really, really crucial. I have been thinking about this nonstop in my job, which is, like I said, is in repro comms. And just knowing that when the Supreme Court decision comes down, there are a lot of people that are going to be experiencing a specifically religious trauma around that, because of the way that their community is growing up. have been a part of making these political things happen, and because of the teachings that they grew up with that are now being sort of codified into law in the United States. That's a specifically religious trauma. Like there's so, and I think my experience has been in spaces of like politics and progressive nonprofits, people are sometimes a little cagey to talk about religion. They don't really want to touch it. They don't really want to think about, okay, how does religion interact with what we're doing right now? Like, how are the people that we're trying to serve experiencing religion? Is that religion like helping them? Is it helping to make them better people? Is it making their lives better? Or is that religion hurting them? And they're just cagey to talk about it. And I really think that it is very crucial that we talk about it. You cannot address the ills that are plaguing our society right now without religious literacy, because there are so many specific religious traumas to what are going on right now. So that is that's my entrance into this work. I think that having a lens of religious trauma over everything that I do, whether that's in my day job or in my writing or in my activism with Church Too, has really informed that. And I think becoming more literate about the ways that spiritual and religious trauma works has helped me to be able to write better about it and to be able to really truly help people with what I write, because of how deeply it affects them. So that maybe was not the full time because I talk really fast, but I feel like we're going to be wishing at the end that we had more time. So we'll just claw those couple of minutes back and let the next person go.
Thank you so much, Emily. So appreciate what you have to say and the couple of minutes. And it's just one, so you did great. So Brian, if you would be willing to go next. And let me just remind everyone who's not speaking to please mute. That would be very helpful. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? The mic? Yeah. Good. My name is Brian Maynard, and I am a licensed professional counselor, former pastor. I got a Master of Divinity, learned how to read the New Testament in Greek. So kudos for that, whatever that means. A lot to overcome. And yeah, I was a pastor for about 17 years, and I was all in. I grew up in Appalachia at ground zero of the Hatfield and McCoy feud, and I've written a memoir that's going to be out in the next year and a half or so about the relational neurobiological stuff of trauma. I'm excited about that. This is a second career for me, being a counselor, and I became a counselor because I needed to learn how to deal with religious trauma, generational trauma. I went back to school to figure that out. So I'm a work in progress here. My work, I work with a lot of former pastors, worship leaders from church life who have had to reinvent themselves after they've morphed. Some of them have deconstructed their faith. But most of my work in terms of the process of religious trauma is giving people permission to change. It's part of the process is really learning how to be with people in their process and knowing how to support and validate the trauma that they've experienced. And one of the ways that I do that is to simply help them understand why they got into religion to begin with, and just to really feel the longings there, the sense of meaning, the answer to the questions like, what's life about? What are people for? Friendships, containers of belonging. And I live with them in the process of appreciating what they thought and maybe had in the beginning positive experiences, as a way then to validate the actual wounding that occurs, because there's such a violation there of that initial sense of belonging and what was trust building. And I want to, like, that process right there of wounding, as bad as that is, it's for us as healers, it's that almost that miraculous moment where the transformation is occurring, because a person is actually, they need the permission and the support to be moving out of a level of consciousness that is represented by religious trauma. That container is by nature dualistic. It only sees the world in terms of there's a right way and a wrong way to believe, and a right way and a wrong way to do everything. And now this person is having experiences where their consciousness is expanding, and that container no longer is safe for them to remain. And so I sit in the process of grieving and validating and giving them permission that it's okay to ask questions. People come in with trauma who have given their heart and souls to this, and they need a container where they can just sit in that. And I provide that more expansive consciousness that they're growing into, of just sitting with all that wounding. And it's like being a midwife, but with kind of a relational attunement thing going on. And they need a place where they can be angry and let that anger channel itself into questions that it's not been safe to ask. I have heard some pretty amazing questions, like, I mean, and this has been a process-oriented way of asking questions. It's like, is it okay for me to say I don't trust in the Bible anymore? You know, and to actually live into let's live into the way you experience that question, and what's happening for you to be able to let that happen. And questions like, does God meet some of the traits of a malignant narcissist? I've heard those. And is God a genocidal maniac? I mean, those are the kind of things, and these are coming from former pastors who've sat with me. You know, I've had some of those questions myself, and it's really the process, not of going backward like their families and their friends are telling them they are. They're actually expanding through that, or they could be. And so my role is to simply sit and allow and support and give permission for them to change, because ultimately the process of wounding leads, if it's processed well, to a level of consciousness where you can stand behind light and darkness equally. The reason we have religious trauma is because the level of consciousness only stands behind the light and identifies with the light side of reality. And consciousness actually stands behind light and shadow equally. And so I hold some of that space while they're transitioning from only identifying as with being the light side of reality. That's not easy, but I think as healers, it begs the question, I'll finish with this. Have I done the work with my own unconsciousness, my own shadow, enough to be able to stand behind the conscious me and the unconscious me equally? And if that's happening, then I have become a spiritual person, a psychologically integrated person, and not for the faint of heart, but we don't have to be perfect when we're with people. So that's what I do. It's a consciousness thing, embodied. I work with the body and help people die out of a right and wrong view of reality into, I can stand behind reality as it is and be with it as it is, which doesn't make a lot of people happy. because they want results and they want fixes. And this is not a fix. This is a be with, where you can validate everything, but then also learn to be with it as it is. And that's the nonviolent way of transformation as a process. And it's also the end goal. So sometimes that helps work, sometimes it doesn't. But thank you.
Thank you, Brian, so much. Appreciate your remarks. And Joe, you're up next alphabetically. So,
Am I on? Yeah. Yeah, my name is Joe, and I am a marriage and family therapist here in Nashville. And I come to this work similarly to Brian. I was raised in very rigidly fundamentalist evangelical movement. My dad was a pastor. I went on to be a pastor as well. I was a pastor for 12 years. And through my own lived experience, like kind of what got wired up in me dramatically was this hardened and rigid belief that I had to reject myself in order to be in the right standing with God. And in this kind of holiness tradition, what I had to learn in like denying myself was a virtue. And through some other traumatic events that happened, like what I learned to be was like a good boy, which meant the harder I could learn to reject myself and put myself down, the more recognition I got as a good person. And that seems to be kind of the type of people that I work with. And a lot of it kind of came to a head, which, you know, you can only hate yourself so much before things start to not work well. And luckily, and I can say this now with a lot of clarity, luckily in the middle of my ministry, I just completely fell apart. Like I couldn't keep doing it because there was my heart wouldn't let me come in and just hammer people about hell, which is what was expected of me. And my heart wouldn't let me do it. And so I was hated. Which was fantastic. Like, and my system couldn't handle all the rejection. So I fell apart and went back to school to be a therapist. And then there I found like a tremendous amount of healing. And the way that I found the healing is learning how to love myself, like really finding that space inside of myself that is the thing that I was trying to get there, which is like this unconditional love. And part of my healing came in like learning how to witness my true nature, which is love. And that's kind of become my new calling and passion, but with myself and it's with clients, part of the way that I work, I use a really spiritual model of therapy, internal family systems. And I try to help people with the parts of themselves that are polarized when they want to feel love, but feel guilt. And well, I do a lot of work with the shame that kind of comes with kind of coming out of a system like that. You know, to want to exist means that you're defective in the culture that kind of I grew up out of. And it seems like the types of people that are coming to me are trying to help out of like that pile of shame because they exist and have needs. And it's a lot of fun to like help people kind of separate the parts of them that can kind of be harsh, that used to protect them at one point. And when people are learning how to kind of separate out of some of their identification with that, what they're finding inside themselves is unconditional love. And I love to see people learn how to embody that unconditional love. Find that in their bodies and learn how to be a body and a soul. And that's one thing up until about 10 years ago, I had no connection to my body because that was like the foul thing. And helping clients reclaim their bodies and be proud of that is something that brings me a tremendous amount of joy. And seeing people be able to kind of look in the mirror and not be required to hate what they see is is really beautiful. It's a really rewarding life, and it's rewarding to be on a journey where I'm also having to continually kind of set some of this stuff down and get curious about the parts of me that still want to, attack and continue on this path of healing. But there's so much work to do. There's so much pain with the people that are waking up to the reality that this doesn't work as a as a way, and that there's another way to live. And I'll close with this last piece, but I think the hardest part in the continued growth of this is when you're in that kind of culture, usually there's family members that are still in it. And in my experience, all my family is still in it. And so my experience to be with my family is having to be able to be with myself while somebody else thinks I have two heads. And surviving that kind of rejection is also a cool part of the healing journey. Learning how to love yourself so deeply that you can stay if you need to be in some kind of relationship with somebody who doesn't know how to accept you, I think is something that our culture ought to learn how look into. How can we hold space for all this nuance? And it's not always easy, but it's an interesting thing to do. And then there's some people that just can't be with their families and they're having to grieve that there's just no way to be with all of that rejection. And it's a sad thing that I'm looking forward to seeing how we work with as a community and a culture.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you so much. Appreciate that. So much richness in all of these comments. And if we could move to John Nichols, you're next alphabetically. I apologize to Ebony. It's your fault. You have a W last name. But if you'll pick up from here.
Sure. Yeah. I'm John Nichols. I'm an LPC in private practice in Brentwood. I am the product of decades of Christian education. I went to Lipscomb High School, and I attended Rhodes College. Let me rephrase that. I was enrolled at Rhodes College for a couple of years. Can't say I really attended. And then I went back to Lipscomb University because I knew I'd finish, because there was, you couldn't drink and chase women on campus. And then years later, I went back to Lipscomb and got my master's degree in professional counseling there. So, and I was raised in the church. I mean, ever since I grew up, it was Sunday morning, Sunday evening, Wednesday night. And what I tell people is I know enough about the Bible to be dangerous. I'm the guy that you don't want in Sunday school, because I'm quick to argue and say, well, that's really not what the Bible says. And I could tell when I was an undergraduate at Lipscomb, and I was, I walked in a true believer, they had me at hello. And when I was starting to learn more about, when I was taking these religious theology classes and apologetics and things like that, one of the things I started noticing, I would consider a lot of circular reasoning, when it came to, this is what we believe and this is why these rules are so perfect. And but I definitely felt like that they were preaching to the choir. There wasn't a lot of room for discussion or questioning. And depending on who the professor was, sometimes, you could be challenging, and it was taking in a place of love and safety. And other times it was, you need to get right with God, just suck it up. One time in class and talking about how the reason there's a Holy Trinity is because Trinities are perfect. And I'm like, well, why are Trinities perfect? How come 4 people aren't perfect? Why aren't 5 people perfect? Why is it 3? And they said, well, because 3 is perfect. And that was it. And that was the role I get. And that was the answer I got as to why there's the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So that being said, I also came from a family that we were very active in the church, but we weren't dogmatic at all. I think the reason we were Church of Christ is because their parents were, and we always went to early service so we could beat the Baptists to Luby's for brunch, So it was something that we enjoyed, and it was something that was connecting, but it was nothing that I'd never had the experience necessarily of, some charismatic leader in the church leading in an abusive way, or being part of congregations that I ever felt ganged up on. A lot of what I did notice were a lot of opinions. And I feel like there were a lot, at least from what I noticed in my little world, where there were a lot of people who spoke with authority over a book they probably never read. A lot of bumper sticker theology, and this is what people would use to lead the charge. Like, well, the Bible says don't do this, the Bible says don't do that. Just really a lot of don'ts, not a lot of do's. And that's one thing that I've noticed in my practice now when people come to me with, religious trauma. It's just like there's this long list of things I'm not allowed to do. And if I do some of these, then I'm bad. And then there's some of these things that I do that I actually don't see anything wrong with. And now I'm struggling because I'm a sinner, because there are things I don't think they're bad, but the church is telling me they're bad. And how do I rectify this? Without the focus on the God that I was taught about, well, these are the things you're supposed to do, like love people and be kind and share your toys and all this other stuff, and be a friend to everyone, not just the people that you think are cool, and these are the things that I feel like I've really gotten lost. We've gotten so caught up into like, these are the rules, these are the rules, these are the rules. And if you don't follow them perfectly, things are wrong. So that's one thing that I see a lot. And I see also too, this whole idea, I was thinking about this talk today and I'm like, it's too bad the Bible isn't more like the DSM. Like you can update it and revise it. Like the more we get some more facts. So let's update it. Right. And like, we have these different translations and all that, but it's, trying to take this ancient book and make it relatable to today. When we have problems now that I don't think could even have been from these people who wrote it, could have even been anticipated. And so then there's a lot of struggle with that. The way that I work with people in my practice when they're struggling with their beliefs is first off, trying to create a place of safety. And this idea of, I feel like for a lot of people that have been religiously traumatized, I had someone shared with me an article they read and they were like, trying to forget religious trauma is kind of like trying to forget English. Once you've learned it, once it's so ingrained in you, it's just there. And it's like you guys said earlier, it's not so much, trying to get over it and forget it and making it a part of historical record as much as it is, how do I live with this? And how do I have these beliefs in my head that feel like that they're against each other? Like one is I'm a sinner, I'm bad. And another one is, hey, I'm lovable and perfect just the way I am. And how do you rectify that? Also working in Brentwood too, as you could imagine, there are a lot of people who come to me and are very insistent on wanting a religious slant in their counseling. And if they don't get it, they're really not interested. And what I tell people is like, well, if the answer was, well, let's just pray about it, then you wouldn't be here. And then having people who come to me and feel like that's a failure of their part of, I've prayed, I've done all these things, I've been penitent, but yet I'm still in this place. I still can't get past it. And really trying to, people forgetting that we're humans and that wherever there's human beings, there's imperfections and there's problems. And this, again, this whole idea, the thing that I see the most of more than anything is this idea of these are the rules I have to follow. If I don't follow these rules, I'm somehow defective and doomed. What I see along with that, I don't see so much the leaders that are involved doing a lot of persecution or anything. What I'm seeing more is like of the congregation. And then when someone missteps, questions, wants to change, wants to pivot in some way that goes against what the church has been preaching to them, what I'm seeing a lot of is this trauma of betrayal and this trauma of abandonment. And how do I deal with that? These are the people I've loved my entire life. These are the people who have loved me my entire life. And now I'm saying, I'm not sure if I believe all this, or I'm questioning my sexuality. I'm questioning whether or not this is all real, or is this just a myth that's supposed to help me be a good citizen? And not a lot of room for it. This on or off thinking that comes from their church of origin. And again, it's just, well, and they're going from a place of, I'm feeling brave, I'm ready to explore these things, I'm ready to discuss them, and then the support system gets ripped out from under them. You know, and what do you do with that? You know, because it's more than just, gee, I get pissed off some people at work. Well, you can always get a new job, but we're looking at people. It's like, I have to find a new community, I have to find new family, I have to find new friends. And then finding people who feel stuck, it's like, as soon as I let them know what I think, I'm going to be kicked out. As soon as I let them know what I think, I lose everything. So how do you sit with that? And then how do you look at someone and say, well, I mean, and the thing is, you know, and I'll even say, you like, you don't have to tell anyone anything. This could just be our secret if you're okay with it. And then for those people that are holding on to things that they can't keep secret, how do you, you know, encourage them to, or how do you sit with them and help them make the decision that could irrevocably change their lives, with no guarantee of, hey, if you make this choice and are true to yourself and how you feel, everything's going to be okay. So that's really all I got.
Thank you, John. That's a lot. Appreciate it very much. And last but certainly not least, we'd like to hear from Ebony Webb. Thank you, Ebony.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. So, yeah, I used to be a Johnson, and then I married a Webb, and I'm at the end of everything. So it is just one of the things that happens with marriage, right? So, wow. So I am a clinical psychologist. I own a practice with 2 locations, both in Nashville and Franklin, that really serve families across the gamut, including, you know, very common touchstone of trauma. And a large portion of our practice has served many families that have adopted. And I'm certainly going to speak about that, because I think you cannot talk about adoption and not talk about the intersection of religion and religious trauma that impacts even some of the decision making of people who adopt that we have served. I'm not saying across the board, but that we have served. But personally, I am a child of a prison chaplain. His father was a pastor of a Church of Christ. So I've grown up with pastors and grown up in the church my entire life. But interestingly, there's something very different between being a PK and a CK. And my experience of the church was very, very divided, because the church that my mother and I attended on Sundays, as my father was working on Sundays, was predominantly white. I mean, I can't even say it was predominantly white. There was the members and then my mother and I. So grossly non-diverse, and we experienced tremendous racism. And so my experience of the intersection of religion and trauma also has that intersection of racism embedded in it. And it was quite difficult. It was quite difficult to have church services talking about missions work, going to Africa where people were dressing up like gorillas and dancing in the aisles. So there was no difference in those experiences there to honestly the experiences I had in my public non-religious school. But going to worship with my father in the prison that was incredibly diverse, sadly, of course, with the BIPOC community, but also experiencing a different side of religion. And so, you know, I grew up in a home where inmates that were released were coming to get their lives together, and us opening our home as a place of fellowship, no matter what you did and where you've come from, and seeing the church being a place of healing as well as a place of harm. And so when I moved into psychology, I actually went to Minneapolis, Minnesota for school. I went to an undergraduate school of Christian liberal arts, Northwestern College, where I experienced the same racism. And I mean, it just kind of escalated. Like people in Minnesota, there's Minneapolis, which is very, very blue and very, very liberal. And then there's the rest of Minnesota. And so, people would come up to me and be like, you're the first Black person I've ever touched. People running their hands through my hair in the inn lounges because they'd never touched Black hair, I suppose. And so, there was always this kind of, cross experience. And it wasn't until truly I left the United States and spent time in the Middle East where I came to have a different perspective on religion. And while I was there, both Jews and Christians and Muslim and Palestinians were like, oh, you're from the US. You're not people of the book. I mean, that was like the common consensus. And so, but what was interesting there too was that I met people of different backgrounds, ethnicities, and they wanted me and my father and I got to go and sit down and talk about our experience as believers in the United States and the racism that they had come to understand that we were experiencing. And it has changed me immensely in terms of the lens of understanding, because so much of Christianity that I grew up in was very Western. It was been very scarred by racism. My grandfather, who was a pastor, told me that God had cursed us to be Black. I can look back at that and understand the lens of the life and the experience that my grandfather grew up in the United States. But it did scar my sense of my relationship with God and what I needed to do, but also what I couldn't do because I can't change my skin color. And so again, I've been twice to the Middle East, and it has been one of those areas of healing that enables me to come back now and sit at tables in my practice with people who are coming from the evangelical Christian church with very, very skewed lenses. And you cannot deal with adoption, especially in this region, if you're not willing to deal with the evangelical church. And my whole passion is going to those churches right now to talk about, you're not equipping people. You might as well just send money to missions, because you are not equipping people to do the work that is required to deal with the trauma of adoption. And in fact, we see a lot of children coming into that being scarred by people who have their own religious trauma, their own sexual trauma, and all sorts of things mixed up into what they're doing. And then they attach God to it. We have literally had families come in and ask us, we just need to know what's psychologically wrong and where's the sin in this child. And it's been difficult. It's been difficult. It's been probably the hardest work I've done. And so I'm very passionate about looking at trauma through whatever lens, but also having to recognize that the church does not look much different than the world. And the more politically embedded it becomes, the worse it gets. And my husband's a Baptist minister. He is about to get ordained at a church in Millersville First Baptist, where we are the only Black couple, Black family that has ever, in the history of that church being there, has ever had anybody become a member there, right? And what has happened even in that has unearthed a lot of religious trauma, a lot of racial trauma that these members are coming forward and talking about. So, what I'm very passionate about is looking at everyone's story. And I think the truth of the matter is that religion, and when we think about trauma, there are obviously the traumas that Emily was speaking about that is widespread in this nation. Like all the traumas that this nation has been founded on, there is a reckoning coming, and it has to happen. And at the same time, I want to understand people's stories, because beyond those type of traumas, there's also the recognition that religion, like race, like gender, like sex, all of those are areas of identity that we have to reckon with, whether we sit in it, we reject it. And I find that when it comes to any of the identity-based traumas, that if we don't deal with it, right? Because our whole dilemma in the human experience is to figure out how to fit, right? That's how we survive, by figuring out how to fit. And this is another intersection that if we can't find a place to fit, we will not thrive, right? And so, I think it's very, very important to look at even the insidious nature of attachment disturbances when it comes to religion, and how then it becomes so traumatized. So I think what everyone is saying is that you lose community and you lose your identity. You lose even your sense of I-ness in that. And it matters. It matters whether you decide to stay in the communities of faith or you leave them. Where are you going to be? And what will that mean? And it's significant across different regions of this nation. And where I think about as an African American, how even the issues of faith in the church have been a refuge and how they have ceased to be at different periods in time. And so this is an ongoing discussion, but I definitely am honored to be a part of this panel. So thank you so much.
Thank you so very much, Ebony, and all of you on the panel for your opening comments. I appreciate them. So rich, so deep, and I hope we can springboard from there. So the plan is for any member of the audience that has a question to put it in the chat, and Melissa and I will be following the chat and asking the question for the panelists to respond to. And while y'all are thinking about your questions and writing them in, I want to remind you, in case you joined us late, if you're hoping to get CEU credit for tonight, please make sure that your full name is in your chat, in your window there, so that Melissa knows where to send that CEU credit. And please make sure that, I think everybody is, but that you are muted when you're not talking. And again, so much appreciation to the panel for being here, for sharing your stories of your diverse set of experiences within religious trauma and how you see it in people and how you work with it. Exactly what I was hoping you would share. So let's see. Question from Gert. Thank you, Gert. I'm struck by the importance of the deconstruction process when working with folks with religious trauma. I also know that deconstruction of Christianity can sometimes flirt with supersessionist theology. Am I saying that right? Okay. Anti-Jewish sentiments. Have any of the panelists encountered this with clients? And if so, how did you engage with it?
Can I pop in real quick?
Yep.
I think that when you're dealing with people, I think everyone's a little different, and I feel like one thing that I try to do is really really meet people where they're at. I would say the vast majority of people that I work with, it's not so much they want to get rid of religion. It's not that they want to turn their back on religion. Most people I find are really looking for trying to reconcile my beliefs and actions and way of being, and then this way that I was brought up and these things that I was taught. So and again, and I'm speaking from my little world of psychotherapy. I get a lot of, I feel like we play a lot of, it's almost like Bible trivia in a way. And I think it's like, for people who want to hold on to their religion and hold on to their beliefs and then justify what they're doing, sometimes I think it does, without going into a whole theological study, because boy, that'll just make your head hurt. But let's just take a look at what's going on with me. This is what I'm struggling with. And then, well, what does the scripture really say about it? One of the things that I go back to quite a bit is, I had a client who initially came to me and he says, I have unwanted homosexual feelings. And I'm like, well, that's called conversion therapy and that's unethical and I don't do that. He's like, well, I still have these unwanted homosexual feelings. And like, I tell you what, I'm willing to work with you and explore it and let's just talk about it. you know, but not from a place of judgment and right or wrong, but let's just talk about like, why is this bothering you? And of course, a lot of it came from, you know, I was told, don't be gay. It's a sin. I'm going to burn in hell. He came from a family who was, really into quoting the Old Testament and, all these things that are wrong, And I said, well, the Old Testament also said, don't eat shellfish. Do you eat shrimp? Yes, I do. Okay. The Old Testament also said, don't wear, clothing's made from two different fabrics. Well, what are we wearing today? Okay. Just kind of doing some reality testing, and just not to say that it's right or wrong, but just to question it. One of the things that really impressed me about this person is he came to me weeks later and he says, well, I believe that Jesus is my savior and the son of the living God. And I said, well, I do too. And he says, I can't find anywhere in the Bible where he said I can't be gay. And I said, I can't either. I know some people who said they didn't like it, but I never heard of our Savior ever saying that. And then going back to the, it's faith that saves us and that works and stuff like that. And I know that for some people, that's really not, for people that, church has really abandoned them and really don't find a place in it. I know that, playing Bible trivia may not be the answer. For a lot of people that I've worked with, it has been. And I think that it's, one of the things that I've done is as a result to really do some research on my own and be sure that I'm saying what that I know what I'm saying and I say what I know. I don't know if that's helpful or if that totally answers the question, but I've found that that's something that, just opening the space and allowing us to be curious about it. And again, for a second, let's not do this binary on and off stuff. We know the world doesn't work that way. When we say that there are these extremes of right and wrong, good and evil, but there's also gray, and as a believer, the reason that I think, God tells us not to judge anyone is because God's very well of the gray and we're not, and so that's something that we're just not wired. We're not able to do, is to have that complete judgment on people and like, yes, this is, you're bad and you belong here, and you're good and you belong here, right? So anyway, I hope that was helpful.
I'll keep my answer short because I see Ebony wants to answer also. But I would say on that, I have some really like interesting thoughts and experiences with like the deconstruction community around a lot of this, because a lot of times in order to deal with their religious trauma and spiritual trauma, people do need to move through that deconstruction process. And I've found that both in my own experience and also with a lot of people that I have talked to and work with and even, interviewed for various things, that black and white thinking piece is really key to where it starts to flirt with not just like anti-Jewish and like supersessionist type theology, but kind of just like almost like new atheism, like all religion is awful, which is not true and also racist. And so, but a lot of people who are in these spaces where they're reacting out of anger and out of trauma just want to put as much distance in between themselves and the thing that hurt them as possible, which is understandable when you are in that reactive space. But I think one of the keys to like doing good work in that is helping to get out of that black and white reactive space and understanding that like there are variations and degrees to which different types of religious sentiment can be either good in the world or harmful in the world, and it's not all the same. And we're looking at this, a lot of us come to this from this very specific like white evangelical Christianity, which is so common in our cultural context, but it's a snow globe world, right? It's the Truman Show of Christianity. It's a footnote in a lot of global Christianities and in the history of religion. We think it's the whole thing. We think it's the whole world when we come out of it. And, I say, as someone who is very, my dad was a Southern Baptist youth pastor when I was born, it was my whole world. And then I got out of it and I was like, actually, that's just a very small portion. That's just a slice of the pie of religion and the way religion has functioned historically. And so, yeah, I have definitely seen that to be the case. And I have found that a big piece of addressing that is getting out of that reactive black and white space where you're just trying to get as much distance between you and the thing that hurt you as possible.
Thanks, Italy. And I mean, I'm just going to speak really quickly to this because I hear this quite a bit. And, um, certainly I heard it more. I grew up in central Illinois, and just the supersessionist theology, the kind of replacement theory, and just flat out anti-Jewish sentiment is so deep, obviously within the evangelical Christian church. And I think I love having conversations with people about this. And I often got the same type of feedback, like, why would you even believe in Christianity when it's used against you in slavery? And one of the things I'll often talk about is that, and this has been my experience, of course, of being in Israel and everything, was that the Bible is far more a Middle Eastern and African text than it was a Western European one. So, I don't, I find it abhorrent that you would deconstruct something to the point that it makes no sense without the Middle Eastern lens, without the Jewish lens. And so we have conversations about it. And I absolutely, this is one of the things that I have, established even in the work that I do at the church that I attend, is like, I'm not interested in talking about anything of scripture without a Middle Eastern lens, period. And a lot of it is horrible ignorance. And then there's, again, so much of this kind of, trauma wrapped up into it, the fear of questioning some of the things that John was talking about, really poor, I mean, not even just trying to think logically, not even understanding the concepts of logical engagement. And so, working with this piece it has been very foundational. A lot of the work that I work with families that have are coming in with that lens. And then, of course, if they're adopting children from that region, right, it has a whole other layer to it. And so I think that's a very important part of the discussion is, even dismantling where this has come from and what are the roots of how you've gotten to this place. The need to replace another for you to have belief. And that right away points to some type of trauma thread or disturbance that's going on in the individual.
Thank you all for those answers. And one more question we're going to try and squeeze in here before we close up, from Kelly Carter. First of all, she says, fantastic, everyone, and I second that. Has anyone worked with someone working through the 12-step program, and how deconstructing their faith has affected their recovery, and the higher power part of that?
I have. What's interesting working with that is helping them shift where the higher power is, if they want to, from a place of external to internal. And that transition, for some people, it can kind of click if they've done enough work. There is a lot. I've seen a lot of people get a lot of rich experience out of going through the steps, until you get to the point where it kind of requires you to have defects and things like that. The type of work that I do, when you come inside, like, there really aren't any defects. And like, that language of defective is a lot of what you kind of get in kind of that evangelical thing, which requires you to be a sinner and things like that. So sometimes they can get caught up in that. And then the difficulty is in bringing them back into self and seeing that what they have inside is the very thing that they were seeking in that higher power out there. Someone that can love them, and you can go to them for anything and will always be there for you. And even when you walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will comfort you. That's kind of what that's designed for. And so it can be tricky getting in the way of that. And I think that there's ways where you can have a little bit of balance and still be in the 12-step community, because there's something cool about having a community of people without having to buy into the kind of the self recrimination that some people get caught up in.
Mhm.
Thank you, Joe. And I am clearly not paying attention because we have 30 more minutes. So we have room for lots more questions. But there was a request from Anne Province if the speakers who mentioned their books would share the title and how to access. And Emily has already responded to that. So I invite the rest of you who have books to please put that in the chat. Or if you want to just say it out loud, whichever one is fine. And other questions or comments that anyone has or that you would like the panel to address.
So my book is not out yet, but the working title right now is Befriending Trauma by Joe McNulty. Brian Mayer.
Love the title. Okay.
Yeah, there's a question from Randy.
Yeah, thank you, Melissa. Randy says, I am a Lutheran pastor. For several years, I have partnered with a licensed counselor and led a support group for those suffering from religious trauma. Thank you all for affirming the things we have been doing and the ways we have been addressing our group. Thank you, Randy. Thank you, and appreciate that you're doing that.
You know, I would like to make a comment about that, if I could.
Please.
You know, I think it's important, you know, we recognize that we do have pastors and we do have people still in religious contexts that see the complexity in their holy books. And it's taken me personally a lot of internal work to be able to come back to my holy book and see that inside of a holy book, there are actually different levels of consciousness in each book, the longer standing ones that have developed over time. A lot of the material, the highest percentage, is still at that stage of consciousness that sees every object in the universe as a separate object, and therefore sees through the lens of separation that there's a right way and a wrong way to do it. So lots of those holy texts have a lot of that law and order, binary, all or nothing thinking. But when you look inside after doing a lot of your own trauma work, you can look back and see inside of some of these religious texts what I refer to as the prophetic level of consciousness, or if we were to use an Eastern term, we could say cosmic consciousness, or Brahman, that kind of consciousness. And when you look inside the prophets, they are actually arguing with their own religious communities and the levels of consciousness that those communities are at. And you can hear them, you can hear the internal civil war going on in their dialogue. They're saying, you can't just have a level of consciousness or psychological development where you side with only associating your identity and your personhood with all good. I am the light. God is only the light and not standing behind the shadows as equally as God stands behind the light. And every time these prophets get killed, sometimes there are psychological prophets who start talking about, you can't just do CBT, you have to get in the body. And it's the same kind of level of consciousness. But you have the same thing happening in the Bible. Mm-hmm. And so while the Bible is a dangerous book in terms of the percentage of the content, in terms of keeping people stuck in fear, there are streams of consciousness in there where there are voices that are saying, you can't take the source behind the universe and turn it into light only. Your heart has to expand in the tension of paradox. Paradox is built into life. There's not a person here who can get rid of religious trauma with the level of consciousness that created religious trauma. It will not work. You can't just even label it as religious trauma. You actually have to go through a process, like whatever the prophets went through, or whatever Jung would say, an integrated person who's integrated the unconscious. It's the same thing. And so there has to be this process where at some point everybody gets wounded. It's going to happen. And you can grab an answer to try to buffer yourself against suffering, and that feels good, and you can build a whole community on that level of consciousness. But until there's this experiential loss of that light only level, you're still going to be trying to change that level of consciousness with the same level of consciousness, and it doesn't work. It just won't work. And I think I'm finished.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, a couple of more questions that have come in. Kelly would like to know, Ebony, if you could offer some resources on seeing things through a Middle Eastern or non-Western lens.
Yes, and I can put him in the chat here too. I really love a lot of the work of Kenneth E. Bailey. He has passed. He was an amazing writer, and he's got a couple of books, both Jesus and Paul through the Middle Eastern lens. But he's a huge advocate. He was a huge advocate because he grew up in Palestine and Syria and Egypt, and recognized that so many of those writers were completely excluded as Christianity moved west. And so it's, I mean, excellent work, excellent book. So I'll put those links in there. And I actually lead studies at my church through those books because I think they're incredibly important for those who are trying to expand their understanding of their faith and to be aware that the lens that we carry here is a Western lens, and it is not the only lens. And so I'm really passionate about really leading groups like that. So I will definitely put those links in there for everyone.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that. A question from.
Could I say something?
Yeah,
I'm not
please.
an expert. I'm not an expert on other cultures, but I do have an appreciation for the Sufi mystics and some of the Persian mystics like Rumi and some of the others. And I just wanted to read this is from Rumi, and this could be in a religious text somewhere as one of those prophetic levels of consciousness speaking to culture of any genre. And I don't know how he made it out alive, he did. But listen to this poem. When grapes turn to wine, which is talking about the process of transformation. When grapes turn to wine, they long for our ability to change. So that whole process of going from grape to wine, there's a longing to some type of deep transformation. When grapes turn to wine, they long for our ability to change. When stars wheel around the North Pole, they are longing for our growing consciousness. And in the next line, he talks about what that consciousness, if that were to happen, that growth, what would that be like? Let your heart listen to this. When the stars wheel around the North Pole, they are longing for our growing consciousness. Wine got drunk with us, not the other way. Just let that sink in for a second. In the level of right and wrong, there's only one God, one way, one truth. The process of change looks a certain way. But what he's talking about is this holistic understanding that when you actually go through a deep letting go of your level of consciousness, longing for that consciousness to change, it's not that you get drunk on wine, it's the wine of the big consciousness gets drunk in you. It's not separated. None of it is separated. Life is not a separate thing. Everything is a part of everything. Everything is is the wine of life making us drunk. That's what he's trying to say. And there's a process for that. You think you're an individual grape. You're not. And that's a hard journey to make for the mind.
Mhm.
But he made it. The wine got drunk with us, not the other way.
Thank you, Brian. Love Rumi.
Yeah.
Yeah. Christina Rumba asked, how do you approach a client who describes religious trauma but is not endorsing the trauma is caused by the church or religious education? For example, someone has anxiety around church teachings, scrupulosity type OCD, refers to anxiety about being unclean. How have you helped, or would you suggest a counselor help a client approach that, or would you?
That's exactly the type of client that I love to work with, because it's so in the body. You don't have to go in, you don't have to be arguing about what the Bible says about this or that. It's a pattern in the nervous system. And that's where I think, for me, I found the most help for trauma is working at it in the body, where you've got kind of anxious loops that go on and on and on. It's with certain models of therapy, it's not too much of a challenge for the therapist to kind of hold space for that kind of pattern of thinking and helping them connect with it through some mindfulness and helping them learn how to have grace for that experience, like welcome that experience. And then there's some ways to heal that. Internal family systems is a great way to do that. If you can find on the directory like internal family systems and OCD, it's one of the it's a pretty good tool for working with kind of those OCD patterns where it might have somehow originated in the being around a religious culture where everything has to be just so, and or you're going to be damned to hell and stuff like that. That stores in the body, but you don't even really have to be arguing about doctrine in the session to kind of work with the effects of that in the body, the anxiety that can kind of come up. And that's the way I'd prefer to work with it, not necessarily in like doctrinal study, like work with it in the body, work with it in the soul, in the heart, because what I've found with a lot of these clients, they have a huge heart, because the thing where the church does, some good, in my opinion, like it helps them like try to at least connect with the heart, even if some ways it might be warped or things like that. So a lot of times those clients have a big heart already. And so, well, everybody does, but they have access to that a lot of times. And so helping them connect with kind of what's going on with them and bringing that into their hearts is a way I've found to be effective with that.
Thank you, Joe. And David, I'm assuming, is it fair to say that answers your question as well about how would you work with folks struggling with sexual issues defined as sins by their community? Yeah, and Doug's comment, can we talk more about the body? So I think Joe, anybody else want to say anything about either of those things, working with sexual issues defined as sins, or how we work with this through the body?
I've got stuff about the body. So the last chunk of my book is dedicated to this question about how we work with the body to heal and recover from these traumatic things that have happened to us. Because I would say this is broadly true of white evangelicalism, but especially true in the traditions that I grew up in, that the body was very, tacitly ignored at best, and actively demonized at worst, made to feel as though your body is a source of sin, a source of temptation. I think I had severe anxiety around my body as a child, because I felt like I had to be hyper aware of it at all moments to make sure that it was not doing something sinful on accident. And so I think, my expertise is in sexualized violence, but I think it applies to religious trauma more generally, that one of the major components of being able to heal well from that is getting back into the body. And there are a variety of ways to do that, right? At this point, suggesting yoga has sort of become a meme, right? Like, have you tried yoga for whatever it is, your depression, whatever. It doesn't have to be yoga, but like, you do have to get in your body, even if it's just sitting and breathing and feeling your body and coming home to it as a place that is a home for you and not a source of temptation or anxiety. Some people find that in yoga. Some people find that in running. Some people find that in meditation. Some people find that in, crafting things with their hands and painting. And there's all kinds of outlets that you can use to get back into it. But I think one of the biggest sort of issues with, kind of to go back to that question about like the deconstruction community, there's a lot of people out there that have like deconstructed their religious trauma in their minds, but their bodies have no idea that happened. Their bodies have not caught up. They have no idea that happened. And their bodies are still living in those traumatized places, even though in their brain, they're like, I don't get it. What's wrong? Like I believe better things now. I believe things that are not harmful to myself and others. I did the work. But I still feel this way in my body. I'm still, and sometimes still reacting out of these cycles of re-traumatization. I think about, for a long time, and this is me speaking out of personal experience, but I've seen other people do it too, where for a long time coming out of this very like harmful version of Christianity, I would just obsessively consume content and media about that harmful version of Christianity, because it was scratching some itch in my brain to continually be in that space, because that's the only space that I knew how to be in. That was the only space I'd been in for 20 years of my life, for my entire childhood and adolescence. And so yeah, I think getting there, all that to say, there's people who deconstruct, their bodies have no idea, and the body is key to it. And it doesn't really matter how you do it, but it is a thing to be encouraged to get back into the body in, of course, a trauma-informed way, because then you have to deal with the fact that when people have had bodily and sexual traumas, especially, getting back into the body can be somewhat fraught. There's a lot of considerations by that. And that's why it's so important for y'all to be here doing stuff like this, learning about that, so that you can approach these things from a trauma-informed perspective. And that's why I did this last summer. I did a day-long workshop with therapists and clinicians about religious trauma and purity culture, because I think it's so important for folks like y'all who are doing this work to be literate and to be informed and to be trained about this stuff. So like, you're here, step one. So yeah.
Thank you. Along those lines, I just have to, if you haven't seen the quote that David Yarian put in the chat, he says, Roy Blount, is that how you say it, Jr., said what he learned in church as a child: your body is the temple of the Lord and it's filthy, don't touch it. So yes, I think we have to bring the body into the whole process.
Linda, could I say something to that just real quickly?
Please.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, I definitely, this kind of self-denigration of the body, obviously, and even in my own story around my ethnicity and everything. And, what I typically do for my really conservative Christian clients, I will say, I'll quote them. I will share this quote. And I said, this is the quote: "This is not humanity's calamity, but its peculiar dignity. We do not further our spiritual lives in spite of our bodies, but in and by means of our bodies. And that's a quote by Oswald Chambers. And most of my clients, they love Oswald Chambers. They love like my utmost for his highest. And so I share this and like, how did we get here? Can we be curious about how the body has just been absolutely dragged through, right? And yet we also want to quote, you know, we're fearfully and wonderfully made, right? And so I think absolutely the healing has to come in through our being, right? And you know, and I try to reaffirm that, which is a lot of how I had to come back to understanding the beauty of my skin color as an act of creation as well. And so I often share that quote, and I will throw that quote in because people, a lot of clients love Oswald Chambers, and then they, you know, at the same time hate their bodies. So yeah.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. There are a lot of good resources in the chat. If you haven't seen them, people are putting resources in there, like Reclamation Collective, a website for that, workshops on religious trauma, etc. So yes, please share anything you have to offer. And Chantel Johnson Jones, can you speak to working with non-binary clients with religious trauma? I find that my clients, especially AFAB clients, really struggle with internalized genderism and have a double bind of deconstructing both, often simultaneously. Purity culture gets mixed in there often as well, so it feels like many deep, almost primal layers to peel away and explore. Lots of grief and celebration. I would love resources as well for further reading. So, anyone want to speak to Chantel's question? And they're asking for the Oswald quote in the chat, Ebony, if you wouldn't mind. Oh, you already did.
I did.
Thank you.
Yes. Yes.
Anyone want to comment on non-binary clients and religious trauma? In some ways, I think we've spoken to it, but is there anything additional that anyone wants to mention?
I mean, I would agree that I think so much of this has been really beautifully addressed. I think working with a client, a non-binary client with religious trauma, you know, I think a part of so much of our work in terms of any struggle, any, you know, these internalized pieces, right? And I know this is not exactly the same, but it is one of the dilemmas that I've had rich discussions with clients in terms of any type of internalized ism, right? And that, you know, we do have to have a reckoning with it. And I think even IFS can be a very important part of that, and having a dialogue with those internalized parts, right? And being able to even give voice to both versus just assuming that this is how it is, or that one side is better than the other, but to actually sit with both of them and allow those voices to be there. I think so much is that we kind of override, or we've decided this one is bad and thus I have to avoid it and ignore it. And that's what creates the schism. And so I think being able to sit and then be with the grief, be with the emotions that are attached to those voices inside. And also, as odd as this seems, of any of our people who have suffered trauma, there's an exquisite wisdom to even the beliefs that they carry around this, right? At some point, that belief made sense in order for them to fit, in order for them to have a place of being. And so we don't want to override that, right? Let's explore the wisdom of that thought. Let's explore the wisdom of how it served you at a certain point and how it may no longer be serving you, because that is a new form of wisdom. So that's what I'd like to add into that discussion.
Thank you, Ebony. All right, we have about 5 minutes. Is there anything else that anyone on the panel would like to add? Not required. Yes, please. Go for it,
Yeah,
Bart.
so, well, this is kind of piggybacking on the question about the body and what Ebony was saying about the dialogue in the parts. I think it's really important when we're in this, what I'm going to say, right brain to right brain field of attunement energy, the resonance energy, that we're dropping. If we identify, for example, a fight part that's coming up inside of a person around a specific issue, that the fight part is allowed to guide all of us in how that fight part is organizing itself in the body. So a fight part we know is the protective part, and really getting to know the fight part as if it's like a little self in there that each part usually has a primary emotion attached to it. So like a fight part would be anger, and noticing how the anger works, what it wants to do, and if it needs to push to say no, or if it needs a resourcing before it can say no. Fight parts tend to organize around behaviors like controlling behaviors, and noticing how anger moves toward controlling, and follow that in like posturing, and just really making everything like, of course it would do this. Of course, the control of the anger would lead to a controlling behavior or a judging behavior, and how that has served you in the past. And you go back and you just track in the body where that showed up in the past. And my experience is, if that happens often enough, that fight part, which might be sabotaging your personality at work or in your relationships, it becomes an unsung hero. Like, it actually becomes heroic. And when it starts to be looked upon as like an old ancestor that lives inside your body, that's showing up the way we don't know how to honor ancestors in our culture, but like to really sit with that fight part, because now we've gotten to know it's controlling, it's judging, how it works in the body. Those things tend to, over time, feel trust with the big self that's watching that. And so I really appreciate what Ebony had to say about that. And you can do that with any part that tends to have kind of an elaborate structure inside your personality structure. You can follow eye gaze. Some people can't look you in the eye when they're talking about their traumatic experience around religion. It's like, oh, I'm noticing when you're talking about that, it's you look up and to your right, and they don't know they're doing it. And that becomes a world of potential opening to, wow, look how brave it is when you look away. Anyway.
Thank you so much, all of you. I think this has just been fantastic. I'm so grateful to the panel. Perhaps we could just take a minute and silently do a little applause.